Hi there, this is Dr. Simon Middle. I hope you guys are having a great day, and we're excited to be here today to talk a little bit about brain chemistry. So when we think about brain chemistry, sometimes we think about all the different complexities of it. So we're going to try and make it really simple today. Our goal here is not to try and make this complicated or to uh, try and have you be experts in brain chemistry. It's really to think about what are the different hormones and how can I, as an individual, make a difference in what I choose to do around our food, around our exercise, around mindfulness, meditation, yoga, and how do they actually impact us? Because I think oftentimes we look at these things and say, okay, if I have time, it'd be great to do. And one of the things we want to maybe talk about today is saying, well, what if it's actually more important to that? What if it actually has a great impact when you think about your life today? So, how many of you feel like you're stressed or tired, or how many of you feel like I never feel good, or maybe I feel good only in these really limited times, and you'd really like to change that? And I want to start off by saying that can happen. And so, as a community, we're here to help you. Empowering Minds is a community designed to really improve your overall wellness and well being. And we do this through lots of different ways. Thinking about how our emotions, thinking about how we make choices physically and nutritionally. And so, we want to help you with that. And that's what we're here to do today. So, again, I'm excited to be here. Again, I'm a doctor, I'm a physician, been practicing for about 30 years, have been involved in wellness in some way or form over much of my career. And so I'm excited that I can be part of this community and share some thoughts and ideas around our brain chemistry. So, let's think about brain chemistry for a minute. When we think about what are sort of the keys to that, there are definitely key chemicals um, that can really make a difference for us. And when we think about them, we may have heard of some, may be familiar with others. And I want us to think about this in two ways. One is what's happening to the brain itself, to the actual cells, the structure of the brain, and what's happening in between the brain, in between the neurons, right? That which is the neurochemicals. And we have impact on both of those. So the first thing I want to kind of talk about is a concept called oxidative stress. Now, the other way you may have framed this is around things called um, free radicals. And if you remember, free radicals are actually normally produced by metabolic processes in our body. They get produced in excess under stress. And this is why we call it oxidative stress. Now, that stress is not just emotional, it could be physical, it could be nutritional stress, it can be lots of different types of stress that increases this oxidative stress, which increases these free radicals, which then impacts how our brain works. It actually causes inflammation, it can impact the integrity of the cell, and can actually even break down DNA in the cell in the brain. And when that happens, it can lead to a lot of neurodegeneration. We think this has a significant impact on how Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, Huntington's disease forms, and can lead to a significant amount of cognitive changes over time. So oxidative stress has a lot of impact. And then we want to think about the neurochemicals that are involved in the brain. And there are a lot of neurotransmitters and what we call neuromodulators. And so we want to kind of be aware of those. So when we think about neurotransmitters, so that's what leads to communication between one neuron and the next. And remember, we've got about 1 trillion different kinds of connections in our brain. So these chemicals have a lot of impact. The first one is dopamine, and it's usually one that gets triggered when we feel like we've been rewarded. And this is what happens in sometimes when we eat chocolate or we eat ice cream or eat certain sugary foods, we get a hit of dopamine, or maybe we like our games on our phones and get a little win, and that gives us a little hit of dopamine, or we get a like on Facebook or on whatever social media, and that gives us that little hit of dopamine. So we can get these little hits of dopamine over time, but over time, if we get excess amounts of that, it actually desensitizes our brain to dopamine, which means we don't get the sense of feeling motivated or pleasure or that we've been rewarded. And so sometimes when you think about it, maybe at work or maybe even at home, you feel like, I don't really feel like I'm doing anything. That's doesn't feel like there's any goodness that comes out of it or any motivation to continue to do it. And that may be a result of your brain being desensitized to dopamine. And we desensitize our brain in many ways. We'll talk a little bit about that. Another important neurotransmitter, serotonin, which really affects our moods, emotions, and our sleep patterns, as well as our appetite. Serotonin is super important in terms of how depression and anxiety forms. When we have low levels of serotonin, that's typically when we deplete our serotonin, that's typically when we feel depressed and anxious. It's also when we tend to have poor sleep. And even though we may be sleeping a long periods of time, the actual quality of our sleep is very poor. Acetylcholine, which is vital for learning, memory, and muscle control, is an important one. And so, we want to think about how do we build up acetylcholine in our system. And then GABA or gamma aminobutyric acid is a important hormone for regulating our stress and anxiety, and again, our sleep. Things that help modulate those neurotransmitters are endorphins, and you may be familiar with the endorphins. They get produced when we have a kind of a high. All right, so exercise does that. Yoga, meditation can do that. Accomplishment, when we accomplish something, we get a boost of endorphins. It really helps us feel pleasure, but it also is a mood enhancer, kind of helps modulate dopamine and serotonin, and is a natural painkiller. So an important neuromodulator. And oxytocin, which is considered, quote, the love hormone, really involved in bonding and how we bond with each other, how we build trust with each other. Other neurohormones, cortisol, which there's actually a video coming out on Friday of this week. And so that'll talk a lot about cortisol. Melatonin, which helps regulate sleep. Insulin, which we know about in diabetes, but we also know it plays a role in how our brains actually metabolize. And so when we have a lot of sugars, we actually develop insulin resistance, and our brain actually cannot metabolize as much sugar. And then we need to think about the precursors, tryptophan and tyrosine, which are actually important for us to recognize, because we can actually modify how we eat to increase the amount of tryptophan and tyrosine, which then helps us build more serotonin, helps us build more dopamine, and that can be really helpful. So those neurochemicals are important. Now, you're not going to remember all of those, and that's okay. Don't worry about trying to remember all of them. What I want you to think about, though, is what are some of the key factors that can help us regulate those hormones in normal ways? So stress, which we all feel, but also happens not only, again, emotionally, but also physically. So what kinds of things create stress? So we know that when we are nervous or anxious, we know that when we're worried, when we have a lot of worry in our lives, when we have a lot of maybe physical stress, those kinds of things increase our cortisol and actually blunt the response of these neurochemicals, so we can have a lower sense of well-being. So we need to think about how we modulate cortisol, because it impacts dopamine and serotonin, so we will feel more depressed, more anxious, more worried. So it's sort of a self-fulfilling loop that happens, and we want to try and be really careful about how we modulate that. Cortisol also increases the amount of oxidative stress. Remember, that's where the actual physical structure of the brain starts breaking down and increases the risk of premature aging, neurodegeneration, cognitive effects, and degeneration. So we want to be really aware of the fact that it can really have an impact. So when we think about that, what are some of the things that lower cortisol? Well, we can do that. We can actually do that ourselves. And some of the ways we can do that is by meditation. We know that meditation has been actually shown to lower cortisol levels in our body. We know that yoga, exercise does that. We also know there are certain foods that can do that. And I know that Cece will be talking about that in her presentations. And so really pay attention. There are foods that we can do that will help lower our cortisol, that we can cleanse our body with cortisol, from cortisol. Now, I will say that we don't do a good job of managing our stress. And so think about some of the things in our environment that might increase stress. We know that certain pollutants, toxins can do that. We know that a lot of high preservative, high sugary foods, highly preserved or processed foods contain elements that actually increase the amount of cortisol, and that can actually lead to inflammation and breakdown in the brain cells. So we want to be really aware of that. So what about these hormones, though? So when we think about serotonin, for example, which is really that key hormone for depression and anxiety, along with dopamine and along with other neuromodulators, we want to think about, how do I have a better sense of well-being? How can I treat my own depression? How can I treat my own anxiety? Well, there's an emotional component to that. And Lauren and I, in our emotional wellness section, all things emotional wellness, we have some strategies for how emotionally we can do that through techniques of emotional regulation. When we regulate our emotions, our brain doesn't get desensitized to these hormones in our brain that are supposed to be working to our benefit. But when we desensitize our brain to those things, it can really disrupt our sense of well-being. And we can do that through meditation, mindfulness. We can do that through brain spotting. If you're not familiar with brain spotting, Lauren just recorded a video that can really help you understand what brain spotting is and how it can help. Things like exercise, the types of foods we eat. And even though we kind of harp on those things, they're important for our well-being. They're not just nice things to do. It's not just about weight loss. It actually has an impact in our brain and how it functions. We can have an impact on how quickly our brain degenerates. Think about that for a moment. We have a say in how quickly our brain degenerates. I know for me, that's an important consideration in choices that I get to make now. So we want to think about that. We want to think about how we can modulate those kinds of things. We also know that the types of foods we eat provide the building blocks to have healthy levels of these hormones in our brain. So, for example, we know that serotonin, one of the precursors is tryptophan. Now, we find tryptophan in things like turkey and dairy, right? So poultry and dairy. And we know that if we can eat in moderation those types of food, especially if they're not highly processed foods, we can actually have a building block in our system that can actually help us with the building blocks for serotonin, and that affects our mood, our sleep, and our appetite. And so we want to make sure that we use those importantly in our brain. Now, the other important precursor is tyrosine, which is important for the building blocks of dopamine and also for the building blocks of epinephrine or adrenaline in our system. So where do we do that? Where can we do that? So we know things like lean protein, again, things like turkey, chicken, but also fish. And lean beef can actually be good sources of tyrosine. Dairy products, again, everything in moderation. Everything in moderation. Eggs are a good source of tyrosine. Some soy products, nuts and seeds, really good. Things like almonds, pumpkin seeds, sesame seeds, beans and legumes have a lot of tyrosine and provide a lot of those precursor pieces. Whole grains and avocados are also important. Now, what's interesting is some of these foods, things like nut seeds, dairy, avocado, actually have some other benefits because they also can be high in omega-3 fatty acids. Omega-3 fatty acids have been shown to reduce inflammation in the brain. They also improve the integrity of the cell, so the cell can actually produce normal levels of neurochemicals. So those omega-3 fatty acids are also very, very important. So other things that we think about are things like oxytocin. Now, again, this is that love hormone. Now, the reason it's called a love hormone is because it gets released in times of intimacy, and it can also be released at times of pleasure. So not just intimate pleasure, but other times of pleasure as well. So we know it gets them released in social interactions, times of trust, when you're in relationship to that trust, that actually increases the amount of oxytocin released, which gives you that sense of well-being, that sense of bonding. And we know that helps release other hormones of well-being in your brain. It also reduces that oxidative stress in the brain. So again, oxytocin, important in physical contact, both sexual and non-sexual. But also we know that it gets released during periods of time when you're having interactions that are full of trust, full of empathy. It's a great stress regulating hormone. So when you're feeling stressed, one of the things you can do is find that special person that you really connect with, good friend, significant other, maybe even a child, and just have a bonding moment. Just a moment where you don't have to necessarily describe everything that's going on, just saying, hey, I just really enjoy being with you. That will help release some of that oxytocin. And we know during sexual activity, orgasms do release oxytocin. Again, that's that sense of well-being, that sense of bonding. Now, we want to make sure that any activity, physical or that physical contact or even sexual contact, is done in the setting of trust and safety, emotionally feels like it's not coercive, not forced, because that actually increases stress and actually blunts the release of oxytocin. So it doesn't feel like a bonding moment. So it needs to feel like a bonding moment. So oxytocin, important hormone. Again, in those times of stress, think about what can I do to have a sense of that bonding, that trust, that empathy. Even talking about those things in an empathetic way. If you're interested in learning more, we've got some videos on how to communicate out of empathy, and those moments can actually help you release this oxytocin. The other hormone that's important is prolactin. And when we think about prolactin, we think of this in sense of breastfeeding often, but it actually has a significant impact in other forms of stress reduction and also sleep. And we know that, again, physical stimulation can be helpful in that. And prolactin release is important because it impacts parts of our brain that actually are involved in how we perceive the world around us. So, for example, if you're in a place where you perceive the world is always negative, the release of prolactin and oxytocin actually together can give you that sense that, hey, you know what? Everything's going to be okay. Everything's okay. And that sense of well-being reduces use of cortisol, again, that stress hormone, and actually helps repair parts of your brain so that it doesn't degenerate and reduces the amount of aging that can happen in your brain. So think about oxytocin, think about prolactin, again, that physical contact. Getting good sleep is really important. We know that good sleep increases prolactin levels. Again, that sense of closeness, that sense of trust and empathy, all has an impact. Now we know dopamine is sort of that reward hormone that happens in the brain. And there are healthy ways of doing that and unhealthy ways of doing that. And again, if we do it over and over again too much, it actually desensitizes our brain to dopamine. Dopamine is an important part of how we think, how we process information. And so when we lose the sensitization of that in our brain, it can actually lead to us having almost a brain fog. So one of the things that we want to think about is, how do I reward myself in healthy ways? And it doesn't have to be big. It can be as simple as, man, that really went well. That just gives you that sort of normal hit of dopamine. Now, when you eat sugar, it releases dopamine. And when it releases dopamine, we crave more sugar. That's where that craving comes from. It's a hit of dopamine and it feels so good, we want more of it. This is where addiction comes in. Right? Addiction comes in from the dopamine hits we get in our brain. Again, then our brain desensitizes and we actually need more and more and more of it to get the same impact. So we want to do this in really, in what we call emotionally regulated ways, when we regulate ourselves and say, okay, yes, I feel good about what I accomplished. I get that hit of dopamine, that feels good. Now, if I want to do more of that, I might want to say, hey, if I go exercise, oh, I accomplished that. That's good, right? So we can do things that are really helpful and healthy for us as we release dopamine in our brains. So we've talked about dopamine, we've talked about prolactin, we've talked about oxytocin. Serotonin, one of the things we can do is, again, we can eat some of those precursors that build serotonin in our system so we don't deplete serotonin. Serotonin is most commonly depleted when we are in a depressed state or that we feel overly stressed. It will deplete dopamine very, very quickly. And so, again, we want to make sure we're eating healthy so we can build up our serotonin, but also other activities that release serotonin in healthy ways can be things like exercise, good sleep, really important. Now, if you want to understand good sleep, I'll do a video on good sleep hygiene, because good sleep hygiene is really important as we think about how we release melatonin, but also serotonin in our brains, which have very, very positive effects in our brain. The nice thing about serotonin is that it actually helps repair some of that oxidative stress in the brain. And so it's super important for us to really think about how our gut and our brain work together, because they both are impacted by serotonin. Low serotonin in the gut can lead to abdominal cramping, nausea, it can lead to diarrhea. It can kind of irritate the gut, and so it can lead to a lot of that irritated gut syndrome. It can also lead to leaky gut syndrome as well. So again, having normal levels of serotonin, really, really important for cognition, for sense of well-being, for general satisfaction. Again, important things that we have some say in. We know that the release of endorphins, which is that kind of what we get that high when we exercise, actually enhances the release of serotonin as well. So again, we can modulate things like oxytocin, prolactin, dopamine, serotonin. Now, insulin, what does insulin do? So it's important to remember that brain cells can only metabolize sugar. That's what they metabolize to function. So we need sugar. But when we have excess sugar, our cells get resistant to metabolizing because they have high insulin levels. And so when we get high insulin levels, our cells actually start becoming resistant to insulin. And insulin is what's needed for the sugar to actually get into the cell to then metabolize, to then function. So when we then have resistant cells to insulin, that means we're not metabolizing. That's where we get fatigued. That's where we get the crashes. That's where we actually get brain fog. That's actually leading to this increasing stress and less ability to repair the cells in our brain. So insulin resistance, when we have a lot of high sugar in our diet, can be really detrimental. So again, I'm not saying you don't need sugar. You do. You need some sugar. But we want to be really smart about it. Complex carbohydrates are better because we have to break it down into sugars, which then can get absorbed by our brain. Other things that are important are things like vitamins. Sometimes B12 vitamins can be, or the B vitamins can be really important for us, as they also help in metabolism in all the cells of our body, but specifically in the brain. So again, having low B vitamins can actually be detrimental as well. There's a lot of things that we could talk about, but I think that's enough for today. I hope you enjoyed this session. If you have questions or comments, please feel free to leave them. I know this was a little bit of a longer session today, but I do want to provide information that lets you know you have a lot you can do in your own health to treat your brain. And our platform is designed to give you skills to do just that. We want you to feel good about what you're doing. Well, I hope this was helpful, and I look forward to our next session together. If you have any comments, please leave them for us. If you have any questions, more than happy to answer any questions. Have a great day, and I look forward to our next session together.